Even before the attacks on U.S. facilities in Benghazi, Libya ceased on 9/11/2012, the Obama administration began a coordinated campaign to cover up what was an anti-American terrorist attack by al-Qaeda affiliates. By design, the administration attempted to persuade Americans that the attacks in Benghazi were no different from other protests against an anti-Muslim video before and after the attacks, except for the level of violence. This was done for political reasons. When this attempt proved unsuccessful, the Obama administration sought to cover up the cover-up by denying it ever believed the attacks were anything other than terrorist attacks, and simultaneously but incongruously blamed its false linkage to the anti-Muslim video on the U.S. intelligence community. What follows is the evidence which proves these points. In 2012, President Obama campaigned for re-election on a theme that he was ending U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, defeating al-Qaeda, and keeping Americans safe at home and abroad. He sought to portray himself as a decisive, competent, and trustworthy commander-in-chief.
Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat, and Osama bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda has been decimated.
What I've been trying to do over the last 4 years is to say that we can narrowly target those folks who would try to do violence against us or our homeland, and Al-Qaeda has been decimated because
During
of this
2012,
strategy.
terrorism by affiliates of al-Qaeda was escalating in eastern Libya. Libyans warned embassy personnel to leave Benghazi. Ambassador Stevens and the State Department were aware the risk of attack was growing. Yet the State Department, knowing that the Benghazi mission did not meet statutory requirements for physical security, degraded the U.S. security assets available in Libya. Additionally, the State Department was aware that Libyan forces upon which it relied for security outside the mission were refusing to perform as expected. These factors coincided with the anniversary of 9/11 during Ambassador Stevens' visit to Benghazi in 2012. Moreover, there was a specific threat against the United States made on 9/11/2012 when al-Qaeda's leader publicly called for revenge of the death of Abu Yahya al-Libi, who was killed by a U.S. drone strike earlier that summer. Also on 9/11/2012, the CIA informed the embassy in Cairo in advance of a planned protest against an anti-Muslim video. The day before, the protest was planned and organized by al-Qaeda-linked individuals and groups. The protest took place as planned and resulted in a breach of the embassy grounds. Notwithstanding the known threats, the generally dangerous environment, the vulnerable security posture of the Benghazi mission, and the actual violence in the region that day, violent attacks in Benghazi were not anticipated by the Obama administration, as evidenced by the lack of military forces positioned for rapid response to the region. When the Benghazi mission was attacked, the U.S. military and intelligence community almost immediately knew it was a terrorist attack, however. Based on the weapons and tactics used, it was readily discernible that the perpetrators of the attacks had organized and planned the attacks, and they were not spontaneous. Legally, the acts were terrorism if they were intended to change U.S. policy or harm U.S. personnel or interests, which is precisely the objective of al-Qaeda. The day after the attacks, members of Congress, who were briefed in closed sessions by military and intelligence officials, stated afterwards they believed the acts were committed by terrorists.
It was a coordinated military-style, commando-type raid that had both direct fire and indirect fire, military movements involved in it. This was a well-planned, well-targeted event.
What we said, and what the analysts still believe, is that the attackers that night, that some of them were affiliated with al-Qaeda.
Even the State Department recognized it was a complex attack. During the attacks, State Department officials had reason to believe they were committed by Ansar al-Sharia, an al-Qaeda affiliate in Libya. The Libyan president believed it was a pre-planned terrorist attack.
Libya's president said today the attack was not the aftermath of a spontaneous outburst of street protests over an anti-Islam movie.
I have no doubt about this. It's a pre-planned attack.
Terrorism experts believed it as well. The White House recognized that the attacks in Benghazi threatened President Obama's re-election in two respects. A successful terrorist attack contradicted his claims that al-Qaeda was decimated, and they would create a perception of failure in security and a failure to prepare and respond to terrorist acts. The Obama administration reacted to the attacks by portraying them as a reaction to the anti-Muslim video instead of acts of terrorism targeting the United States.
The United States condemns in the strongest terms this outrageous and shocking attack. And make no mistake, we will work with the Libyan government to bring to justice the killers who attacked our people. Since our founding, the United States has been a nation that respects all faiths. We reject all efforts to denigrate the religious beliefs of others. But there is absolutely no justification to this type of senseless violence. Of course, yesterday was already a painful day for our nation as we marked the solemn memory of the 9/11 attacks. We mourned with the families who were lost on that day. I visited the graves of troops who made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq and Afghanistan at the hallowed grounds of Arlington Cemetery. No acts of terror will ever shake the resolve of this great nation, alter that character, or eclipse the light of the values that we stand.
This is a fairly volatile situation, and it is in response not to United States policy, not to, obviously, the administration, not to the American people. It is in response to a video, a film, that we have judged to be reprehensible and disgusting, that in no way justifies any violent reaction to it. But this is not a case of protests directed at the United States writ large or at U.S. policy. This is in response to a video that is offensive. But
different things.
Jake, let's be clear. These protests were in reaction to a video that had spread to the region. We certainly don't know. We don't know otherwise. We have no information to suggest that it was a pre-planned attack. The unrest we've seen around the region has been in reaction to a video that many Muslims find offensive. And while the violence is reprehensible and unjustified, it is not a reaction to the 9/11 anniversary that we know of or to U.S. policy.
Our current best assessment, based on the information that we have at present, is that in fact what this began as was a spontaneous, not a premeditated, response to what had transpired in Cairo. In Cairo, as you know, a few hours earlier, there was a violent protest that was undertaken in reaction to this very offensive video that was disseminated. We believe that folks in Benghazi, a small number of people came to the embassy or to the consulate rather, to replicate the sort of challenge that was posed in Cairo. And then as that unfolded, it seems to have been hijacked, let us say, by some individual clusters of extremists who came with heavier weapons, weapons that, as you know, in the wake of the revolution in Libya are quite common and accessible. And it then evolved from there. Andy, first of all, let's recall what has happened in the last several days. There was a hateful video that was disseminated on the internet. It had nothing to do with the United States government, and it's one that we find disgusting and reprehensible. It's been offensive to many, many people around the world. That sparked violence in various parts of the world, including violence directed against Western facilities, including our embassies and consulates. We are of the view that this is not an expression of hostility in the broadest sense towards the United States or U.S. policy. It's approximately a reaction to this video, and it's a hateful video that had nothing to do with with the United States and which we find disgusting and reprehensible.
Contrary to the claims of President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Susan Rice, who were intentionally and purposefully saying that the attacks were motivated by anger towards an anti-Muslim video, the CIA, Department of Defense, and the State Department were not making that connection. This political posturing is reflected in White House communications. Political appointees in the White House coached senior officials on how to discuss the attacks. The talking points were, by design, intended to influence the manner in which the attacks were publicly discussed. There is no doubt that the intent was for journalists and the public to view the attacks as just another protest motivated by anger over the video and not as an act of terror against America on the anniversary of 9/11. Additionally, and separately, the CIA created unclassified talking points, but even these were the result of a collaborative effort across federal agencies and the White House. They were edited to accommodate the political sensitivities of the administration.
What I said at that point was, look, I'm aware that there are interagency concerns with the talking points. I have my own concerns with the talking points. I will edit them and I will send them back around for a final coordination before we send them to the committee. So what you're looking at here is what I did. I'm responsible for the changes on this piece of paper. The names you see are the names of the individuals who I wanted to send the talking points to one more time before we sent them to you. Robert Cardillo was and is the number 3 in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He represents the DNI at deputies meetings. Alan Pino was the National Intelligence Officer for the Middle East. He was at that deputies meeting. Matt Olson was and is the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Jake Sullivan was then the Head of Policy Planning at State Department and is now the Vice President's National Security Advisor. Mark Giuliano was head of the FBI's National Security Division. Lisa Monaco was head of the Department of Justice's National Security Division, and Ben Rhodes was the spokesperson for the National Security Council staff.
After the CIA talking points were distributed, the Obama administration falsely claimed they reflected the intelligence community's objective assessment of the information then available. As such, it was then claimed the talking points supported their characterization of the attacks as spontaneous and linked to the anti-Muslim video. In fact, however, it was just the opposite. The White House and Clinton characterization of the attacks had influenced the wording of the CIA talking points. The CIA talking points did not reflect the best information available. They were unclassified, so classified information was intentionally excluded, and so were references to al-Qaeda, supposedly for fear of revealing classified sources of information.
There was no doubt in my mind, and there was no doubt in the analyst's mind, although they said extremists rather than terrorists, but there was no doubt in my mind or the analyst's mind that this was a terrorist attack, irregardless of what motivated them and irregardless of whether there was a protest or not.
Although a great deal of attention has been spent analyzing the CIA talking points, it is important to recognize that the White House talking points preceded the CIA talking points. The Obama administration purposely withheld them from Congress. The White House email was not produced until 2014 by virtue of a court order. The administration's public discussion of the attacks was not completely consistent with the CIA's talking points. The CIA talking points made no mention of the video as precipitating the attacks. According to Morell, any protest which preceded the attacks was completely separate from the armed attackers. Also, we know from earlier versions of the talking points that the CIA believed al-Qaeda was involved. Thus, the statements of Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Rice, which linked the attacks to the video, were inconsistent with intelligence known but undisclosed in the talking points, but also inconsistent with the talking points too. Soon, it became apparent that the cover-up was unsustainable. Fox News reported that intelligence officials knew immediately that the attacks in Benghazi were planned terrorist attacks. Members of Congress became suspicious of a cover-up. Furthermore, career employees of the State Department were called to testify before Congress and were poised to contradict the administration's talking points. The administration responded in two contradictory ways. First, it was claimed that President Obama always knew it was terrorism and had told Americans the truth from the beginning. Second, it was acknowledged that prior statements about spontaneous attacks sparked by anger over a video proved to be wrong, but they relied on what information they had been given from the intelligence community at the time. These assertions were both false and constitute the White House's cover-up of the cover-up.
The day after the attack, Governor, I stood in the Rose Garden and I told the American people and the world that we were going to find out exactly what happened, that this was an act of terror.
Immediately after telling Americans that he called the Benghazi attacks acts of terror in his Rose Garden speech, he privately told the man who asked the question that he waited to call it terrorism until he had more information. Amazingly, the voter took no umbrage over the contradictory answers, one of which had to be false. More strikingly, however, is President Obama's answer to a direct question by CBS reporter Steve Kroft on 9/12/2012, the same day he made his Rose Garden speech.
Mr. President, this morning you went out of your way to avoid the use of the word terrorism in connection with the Libya attack.
Right.
Do you believe that this was a terrorist attack?
Well, it's too early to know exactly how this came about, what group was involved, but obviously it was an attack on Americans, and we are going to be working with the Libyan government to make sure that we bring these folks to justice, one way or the other.
It's been described as a mob action, but there are reports that they were very heavily armed with grenades. That doesn't sound like your normal demonstration.
Right. As I said, we're still investigating exactly what happened. I don't want to jump the gun on this.
Steve Kroft interpreted the president's Rose Garden remarks as most objective viewers had, that he avoided calling the attacks terrorism. In response, the president clearly says, right, agreeing with Steve Kroft. He explained that he needed more information before making any such conclusion. The claim at the debate was patently untrue, and President Obama knew it.
What were you first told about the attack? Why were people talking about protests? When people in the consulate first saw armed men attacking with guns, there were no protesters.
Because
why did that go on for
exactly what
weeks?
we were told by the intelligence community. The intelligence community told us that. As they learned more facts about exactly what happened, they changed their assessment. That's why
here, Vice President Biden did not dispute that the administration had claimed that the attacks were protests of an anti-Muslim video and not terrorism. He made the second argument, saying it was because the intelligence community told him it was a protest. The change in the administration's position can be further illustrated by the statements of President Obama's spokesman.
I think it's self-evident that what happened in Benghazi was a terrorist attack.
Follow up on, you earlier said the cause of the unrest was a video, then you repeated that something similar on. I just want to be clear, that's true of Benghazi and Cairo.
I'm saying that is what the incident in Benghazi, as well as elsewhere, these are all being investigated. What I'm saying is that we have no evidence at this time to suggest otherwise, that there was a pre-planned or ulterior instigation behind that unrest.
The cover-up continued after the election. Most recently, after the White House was forced to release the Rhodes email showing Rice was coached to link the attacks to the video, Jay Carney incredibly denied the email related to events in Benghazi. Apparently, the fact that Rice did describe the events in Benghazi precisely as directed in the email was merely a coincidence. The Rhodes email specifically referred to violence which harmed Americans, which then had only occurred in Benghazi. Further, he insisted that they were preparing Rice for appearances on the Sunday news shows based on the pre-Sunday promos, which, he said, focused on the protests at embassies in the region, not Benghazi. Contrary to his contention, however, the promos for ABC, NBC, and Fox did specifically mention the attacks in Benghazi. Susan Rice has rejected calls for her to apologize for her misleading statements.
Do you have any regrets?
David, no, because what I said to you that morning and what I did in every day since was to share the best information that we had at the time. The information I provided, which I explained to you, was what we had at the moment. It could change. I commented that this was based on what we knew on that morning, was provided to me and my colleagues, and indeed to Congress, by the intelligence community. And that's been well validated in many different ways since.
Here, she blames the intelligence community for giving her bad information. As mentioned, this is demonstrably wrong because her public statements were inconsistent with the CIA talking points, which did not mention the video, and inconsistent with classified intelligence reports known to her which linked the attacks to al-Qaeda. Furthermore, she knew there was, at best, conflicting information about the existence of protests in advance of the attack, but she was unequivocal in her assertion that the best information available told them there were protests, which evolved into violent demonstrations.
Talked about the video. My reaction was that's not something that the analysts have attributed this attack to.